Yes, I'm not saying that Christianity was necessary to produce a Karl Marx, for example, but I'm trying to draw some parallels, I think, between Marxism and perhaps Christianity, two of the great intellectual, spiritual even forces of the modern world, and show how Marx is a kind of secular Christian in his thinking and indeed in his theory of history. And I know that sounds strange, it's kind of paradoxical, but here's what I mean. Marx wants to save mankind. He sees mankind in a lost state, especially that part of mankind who lives in a capitalist society. So Marx wants us to be born again, even. But the salvation that he sees is one that can be realized on this earth, in this material world. And indeed, the forces that drive and impel history for Marx are material forces. They're not necessarily spiritual. So, for instance, Marx wants to liberate mankind from the alienation that particularly workers feel in a capitalist society. They are, as we alluded to, they're alienated from the product of their labor. So a person working, say, in a factory in Birmingham or somewhere like that. Marx lived a good deal of his life in London, and so he saw the Industrial Revolution in England, and he saw these workers who appeared to be alienated, indeed were alienated in a physical sense, from the product of their labor. They didn't own what they produced. They didn't have any stake in it. They were wage slaves, as he says. They're slaves, but they're just paid a wage, barely a subsistence wage. But they don't even have the satisfaction of any kind of contact, ongoing contact with the product of their labor. They're not proud of it necessarily. They're not. They're alienated from their nature, the creative nature that we all have by virtue of being human beings. And secondly, people are in that system are alienated from nature and from other people, nature and society. And finally, we're all kind of alienated from ourselves. We do have a nature, but it's not realized, it's not fully realized in a capitalist society. I should also point out, though, that for all of his talk about nature and the human person and its makeup, he really does seem to think that human nature is malleable. It can be changed or it can be improved. And that is a contrast with the kind of, I would call it, Christian realism that we discussed last time in the American founders of the mid-18th century, who believed that human nature was fixed and indeed was corruptible, and that we could ameliorate some of the negative effects of the fall, but that we could only hope for so much in this world. It's the next world where we would be judged fairly by a creator God, for example. But for Marx, there is none of that religious reality, you might say. There's no life after death. There is, again, if there's to be a salvation for mankind, it's to happen in this world, on this earth. And so, again, we have that progression, that linear progression of history, moving to a kind of millennium, a kind of Christian end time, if you will. But that will be realized on this earth, and it will only be realized when capitalism is finally overthrown, which is one of the last stages before the withering away of the state and its replacement with the communist state. And of course, Marx isn't the first to contemplate a communist state either. We can go all the way back to Plato, can't we? And that republic, the communism of property, the communism of wives, the communism of children, in his guardian class and ultimately in the philosopher-ruler class. Now, there's nothing wrong, is there, with wanting to lift the burdens from enslaved mankind. The difference with Marx, I think, is, again, this kind of insistent atheism. It's not a religion with a God, if you will, but Marxism itself became a kind of religion that that spread very rapidly, was evangelized indeed around the world, and was an extremely powerful ideology, system of ideas and propositions. Now, ideology itself is a word that has kind of a negative connotation and a positive connotation. In prior times, John Adams actually pointed this out. He said the word is a French word, idéologie, I think, and he says it's Napoleon who introduced this into the political discourse, and it was there a negative word. But in more recent times, it's come to have a kind of neutral connotation, or maybe even a positive one. In American political thought, famous Harvard historian Bernard Bailyn wrote a book called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, and there it was not necessarily a bad word, a pejorative word. But at any rate, Marxism as an ideology spread very rapidly across the globe, and I think, as we mentioned in one of our very earliest sessions together, Marx really did rule the world from the grave, and he ruled it by the power of his ideas. As I say, ideas that were well-meaning, I think, but that in practice ended up enslaving the very people who he had hoped to liberate, right? The poor classes, always in these communist regimes, whether it be the Soviet Union after the murder of the family of the Tsar, and the Russian Revolution of the 19-teens, or in North Vietnam under Pol Pot, or in Maoist China. There always seems to be a suppression of those very people whom Marx was empathetic toward, whom he wished to liberate, and whom he wished no longer to be alienated, to be integral persons. Somehow or other, it never works out in practice the way he had hoped. But as I say, it's a good impulse to wish people to be liberated, to wish them to be saved. It's the Christian impulse, but again, it's not from a Savior God. It's through a revolution in this world that eventually will overthrow the capitalist system and usher in a system of communism. So Karl Marx, Marxism itself, Marx is a sort of prophet, if you will. Marxism was a substitute religion, I think, for many, many decades in the 20th century particularly. Marx was a prophet of a kind. Even his books were like scriptures, Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital. And the theory itself, the progression of history, is a kind of a Christian view of history, but again, denuded of a God, and particularly a Savior God.